Nice one. Good morning, Gary.
Good
And I'm saying
morning.
good morning because I'm coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. My name's Anna O'Brien. And today, continuing on a series of interviews with Gary Van Warmerdam. I keep describing him as spiritual teacher, the author of Mindworks, creator of Pathway to Happiness and self-mastery courses, host of the Awareness and Consciousness podcast, and founder of the self-mastery community. So as I said, today we're going to be continuing with a series of interviews, and previous interviews we've got to know Gary and his personal journey. We've looked at some of the paradoxical.
Some of the journey.
Yes,
I
yes,
keep changing.
as we all do, continuing the journey. We've looked a little at the paradoxical nature of some of the teachings and lessons. And we've gone on to look at some of the lessons in a deeper way, and we're going to continue with that today. And I suppose the lesson that I wanted to focus on today is actually your lesson 1, I believe, in the self-mastery courses. And it's about getting into that observer perspective. And I think this really underpins, everything that you do in the self-mastery courses, where we start to be able to observe our old patterns of thinking, our emotions, as well as our actions. And,
It's
I
the
think,
first lesson once you get into the paid course, once you get past the intro, you decide to commit.
yeah, terrific. And again, it can seem like such a simple thing, but I really believe this is probably, to me, the most powerful thing that we can start to do if we want to get to know ourselves more and start to have some agency over our actions and behaviors and what's going on for us, and make some changes so that we get to have the life that we want to be living, rather than a life that's really based on pre-programming and what's happened in the past.
Old habits, old adaptive strategies, fear, judgment, other people's suggestion of what we're supposed to be, or trying to please other people. Yeah, it takes a lot of forms.
Yeah, lovely. And so I was first introduced to this lesson with you after I began the self-mastery practices online. But the first retreat that I went to, we sat in a room together, a group of us, and we practiced directing our attention and stepping into different perspectives. And what I notice about that practice now is that we can actually do that quite easily experientially. When you're guided and directed to do it, we know how to do it instinctively, I believe.
Yes.
But often the mind comes in and says afterwards, well, that wasn't true. And so we can have that inner conflict between the experience of changing our perspective and stepping into that observer perspective, and what's going on for us mentally. How does our rational mind make sense of that experience, or dismiss that experience?
You want me to speak to that?
Yeah, please elaborate.
Yeah, think of it, the idea that comes to mind is, think of it as a spider. It builds this web, sits at the center of it. That web is a belief system. And the spider is drawn to sit in the center. This is my worldview. This is who I am. This is my perspective. Right? And then we're looking at the world through this lens. This is what I should do. This is who they are. And they're going to do this, and I'll have to do that. And we build all these narrative stories from this perspective. Right? Then we get guided in a lesson. We move to this other perspective, and we watch the spider sitting there. What's it doing there? It's like stuck. It's like you could be free. You could do so many things, and it just sits there telling you stories and making its web stronger. And anytime somebody tries and offers to change the story, it goes back and it puts the web back together. Right? It's like But if you're guided out to this observer and you watch this, the mind has taken this very limited perspective, usually a web of fear-based beliefs. Looks silly, right? Meditation's over. Now, what does the web do? The web tries to go get the spider and put it back in the web. Because the web is active and alive. It's not a static thing. It's the mind. We've built this neural pathway network that then says, spider, get back in here. This is who you are. And the web of these neural pathways, these patterns of thinking, tell us, go get back in your spot. That thing you just did where you got out of the web, that wasn't real. That wasn't important. That's nonsense. This is real, and puts us back in the same neural network of firing pathways that we had yesterday and the day before and the year before and the year before that. And so this is very often the reaction or pushback thoughts one gets when they, in the beginning, change a point of view, change a perspective, move to a conscious witness observer state, is the mind, we call it the web, immediately afterwards goes, no, we didn't like that. if the spider's not here keeping us together, we'll fall apart. And so the web goes into this, feels a destabilization, the mind feels uncomfortable, okay, and wants us to be a spider to stay in the center again. Now, if you're back in, if you do that and you're in the center of the web, you're like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm supposed to follow all these thoughts. And here I'm in this synchronous web and I feel safe because the web says this is what we're supposed to do. But something inside of us, something that is our freedom, our consciousness, has already got this other point of view and go, but what was that? And so we have this awareness that says, I can move to any point of view that you describe instinctively know as children. We can imagine ourselves, you're around kids, we can imagine ourselves doing anything. It's not just cowboys and Indians and superheroes and we're flying through the air and our cardboard box is a spaceship, right? We have this wonderful imagination about what we're going to be in our future, right? But over the years, we've built this network web. And then as we go to move out of it, to see it, again, the belief system becomes uncomfortable, tries to draw us back in. And so the very nature of waking up, becoming conscious and aware, is uncomfortable to the mind. And you have to be willing to be a bit uncomfortable to take an observer perspective, move outside your web and say, oh, that's my mind. And there afterwards, yeah, it wants me to come back. Oh, stay in the observer perspective. Oh, it's uncomfortable that I'm leaving it. As opposed to, I'm uncomfortable with that practice. The spider version of me, the false version of me who's built this architecture, is uncomfortable leaving it, but your consciousness will feel better leaving it. Will feel the freedom of it.
Yeah. And, what I'm hearing you say there is, the language I use is just a little bit different. We have this framework of how we understand life based on past and present. We project it out into the future. And this framework makes sense based on that. We say, yes, I've constructed a framework and this framework makes sense. And in that framework, I have that constructed identity. And so there can be a lot of fear around stepping out of that framework that we've put our faith in and believed in. And it makes sense based on past and present. And the fear of, well, if I step out of this framework, if I step out of this constructed identity, then there's too much uncertainty. Now I don't have a framework. Now I don't have a constructed identity. What is life about? And who am I? And I notice questions come up in the self-mastery community.
All the time the question is, if I'm not these personalities, these constructed characters, then who am I? And that interesting question is very often the web, it's not a question. Usually when you look at the question, it's not when I listen to someone's question like that, it's not like, oh, well then who am I? It's a question. No, it's not. It's a question. Well, then who am I? Right?
Yeah, it's fear-based.
So fear is asking the question, which is the spider web network, is, hey, that's destabilizing to the structure I've built in the mind. Please don't go there. Is the underlying message of that question. It comes out as a question, but it's not. It's a defensive, I don't know who I am. That feels uncomfortable. Let's not do that again.
Yes.
Okay. So, but this is where awareness is. You go move the spider around, and then you watch the web react. And you go, oh, when I got the hang of it, the first few times I was like, oh, I got a change in my point of view. This perspective is totally different. And fear would come up. New things, I experienced new things because I wasn't in the same locked in state. New things, and it felt great. And then afterwards, the next day, a couple days later, you're like, oh, what was that? Was that okay? Is this okay? Am I going to be all right? And so after a while of that, and so I call a friend, I'm like, hey, this happened. Am I all right? She's like, yeah, you're fine. Oh, okay. So, but then I learned how the mind reacts to me changing, no longer playing its spider-side role. And when fear would come up, I would after I'd be like, oh, this is progress. The mind's uncomfortable. I'm making progress. When you look at it from a consciousness perspective as opposed to spider mind perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And I noticed that other fear comes up, that broader fear of, I put so much faith and trust into this story that I have, this framework and this identity. Then if I can't believe that, how do I believe anything? And people can feel very ungrounded and adrift.
Yes.
If I'm not believing the old story, how can I believe anything? And initially, that's very scary.
Well, and here's the very scary part. Because the mind, how could I believe anything? This is the mind's reaction again. This is the web going, here, let me scare you by exaggerating this, and taking it out of, oh, you're just looking at this world from a different perspective where things now look different. If I get up and I look at the room from over there, everything looks different. I see the backside of this monitor. Okay, I see the chair that I don't see sitting here. Right? So I see a chair, I see the backside of the monitor. It's the same room. I'm like, what happened? Okay. So you look at yourself, you look at aspects of yourself in a completely different way. You're like, oh. Now the mind takes that, instead of going, oh, that's interesting, I'm looking at new aspects or different aspects of myself I didn't notice before. The mind says that I don't know who I am. I don't know who I am. I don't know anything. There's nothing to believe in. These are huge exaggerations. Let me take this different perspective and say, oh, I'm not the guy I describe myself as in these stories. I can look at myself differently. I can have a different narrative about myself. It takes that experience and the mind goes, well, let me scare you back into the center of the net by exaggerating it to, well, if I don't know who I am, I don't know anything, I can't believe in anything. Because one of the things, you've moved the whole web. Everything's like, oh, feels like my whirlwind. It's like, well, that web of beliefs is not your world. It's the structure of your inner world you hang on to. But yeah, you're questioning it. And so But this is why the course is set up. Well, let's just do one story, one belief, one emotion at a time. Okay. I
Yes.
don't
Yeah.
recommend doing them all at once.
Mm.
And you don't have to. Just
Yeah.
change the ones you choose to change.
Yes. And just getting comfortable with that practice of changing perspective. Practice it and get used to that feeling of leaving the old story and getting open and curious about different perspectives. Because I find, one of the things that I notice from before I did these practices to now is, the idea earlier that there's one right perspective and that we should all be agreeing on this correct perspective. And just like you described, as soon as we move, we're in a different perspective, we're seeing something different. Or if you and I are sitting here, you and I are seeing different things, even though we're having a shared experience. And so our perspectives are going to be slightly different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's okay. There doesn't have to be one right perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've at retreats, I've always thought it'd be very interesting to, have a number of people who come to, say, a week-long intensive in Mexico, to get their story on day one. 10 different people, 10 different stories. And on day two, same ceremony, same process, meditative, they will have 10 different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
They will have pulled out of my instructions, or guided meditations, emphasize different things, and other people will have completely ignored different parts. They will go in a different direction about what they do with it. So it's but I trust that it'll work out for them. So, but
Yeah.
I've gone through this identity thing, when I felt it, when I left college and I go to the Navy. Well, even growing up on the farm, going to college, I'm like, I'm in an unfamiliar place. I don't know who I am here, and then kind of later in college, feeling, okay, yeah, I can do okay here, comfortable here. I leave college for the Navy. I'm in new territory. I don't feel comfortable in my new identity. I was comfortable in the old one. Then I leave the Navy, knowing that I was letting go of what this identity persona that was safe, and structured my identity and narrative around. But I'm like, that's not me. And then I figure it out in business. And then I leave business, sales. Like, I'm going to start my own business in this. I'm going to go teach this. Oh, And so it's like, I have no identity there.
Mm.
I have no story of myself there. I have not built an inner world where I feel grounded and safe. So I step like a spider. I'm like, let me start weaving what I do here and build a presence where it's like, yeah, this is who I am. This is what I do. And then in the teaching process, having my own process of teaching, having that wipe out and go, oh no, I'm not teaching that way anymore. I don't know what I'll do now. And go back to the drawing boards and do it again. A number
Yes.
of times, a
Yes.
number of times.
Mm. Yes. And my mind's just going, oh, we could go off on a tangent here, but
Yeah.
I'm going to resist that
Yeah. But
temptation right now.
each time it was uncomfortable, a letting go of my identity, building a new inner world, and building a new way of being in the world.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
normal. We all do it. We all do it. But here we do it consciously.
Yes. And so the observer perspective allows us to be less attached to that identity and that one perspective or the right perspective, and be a little more open and curious. And that allows us, I think, to observe ourselves without being so attached to being a particular way on a particular day. And
Which is here's that move into the observer. It allows us to, and why it's key, is it allows us to observe the stories, be present with the story, be present with the emotion, be present with the part of the mind that's narrating a story and not believe it. Here's the thing, because that observer presence, it's like, now we can apply skepticism. We don't have to believe our mind. We can feel safe and comfortable in that new perspective once you practice being in it. It's like, now we can move around these pieces and parts of ideas in our mind, a self-judgment, a guilt, a shame, a fear. Like, oh, I can move this emotion around. So we start to see that these are kind of just parts that float around in our mind, emotional energy. And we're like, oh, I don't have to do that. I could do this instead. And so we start moving, we get to redraw and create a new web, change it, whatever part we want about it. And so, but this is what you have to do. First is you have to get out of the center of the web.
Yes, yes. And that not believing then gives you a bit of time and space. You're not overly identified with that position or that perspective or that story. Gives you a little bit of time and space. And, that gives you choice and agency. Do I want to continue with that pattern? We can even look at, that pattern made sense in the past. I can have empathy and compassion for why I chose that pattern at that time. Is that still relevant now? Does it serve me well now? Could I choose something different that's going to send me in a different direction? And again, it being about choice and agency rather than the automatic, I did it in the past, I'm doing it now, I must continue to do it in the future. And so I'm going to get the same outcome if I do that.
Absolutely. Only in that observer perspective do you have a chance for another choice. Because if you're in the web, you will behave in the automatic pattern.
Yeah.
So it's the first step. Move.
Fantastic.
Move outward. The judgmental part of ourselves only comes up with judgments. The victim part of ourselves only comes up with poor me stories. The fear part of ourselves only does anxiety. It's like when those things activate, they do what they do. They don't have any options for doing anything else. But when we move into witness or observer consciousness, we can go, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to refrain. I'm going to do this instead. Or I'm going to pause. Or I'm not going to believe that. It's like choice, exactly like you said, choice and agency now exists for you.
Yes, super powerful. And in fact, I believe in this so much. I start every session with every client by getting an observer perspective. We do a meditation, we get an observer perspective. That's our starting position. And from a neuroscience perspective, there's actually a part of the brain which allows us to observe ourselves. And just like any muscle, the more that we use that part, the stronger it gets, the more natural it becomes that, yes, we can observe ourselves very quickly at any moment in the day and just check in, what's going on for me here? What am I thinking about? What am I feeling emotionally? What am I sensing in my body?
Yeah. But is that something you have to intentfully desire to do and something you have to practice?
Yeah. Awesome. Beautiful, powerful.
It's a life changer.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I always think if people have one takeaway, start observing yourself from that open and curious, accepting perspective. Can I just check in what's going on in here?
Well, here's a trick. And I think it's in I think I do that meditation that get to the outside observer in the attention exercise, which might be one of in the intro courses. So people, when they're like, oh, I'm going to observe myself, they generally move to the part of the web that's judgmental. Oh, what are you doing? This is silly. You're wasting your time. You should be more productive. You're not doing it right. So when I guide people in that audio, or when I do it individually, I'm like, good, you're watching the stories come out like that. Now watch that point of view. And then there's some reaction of like, oh, that's appalling that voice, that version of myself is treating me that way. I hate that guy. So there's a reaction about the judgmental point about ourselves, right? And we're not in the observer yet. So then I have them move out of that point. Let's try a fourth point of view. And they look at what's going on there. It's like, well, that person just taken the abuse of the judge, and this person's appalled at it. But this person's like, what's going on here? This is interesting. Okay, now we're in the observer perspective. Okay, so a lot of people, I think, try and do mindfulness, was like, oh, observe your thoughts. But their version of mindfulness is like, they're one step out of the center of the web, but they're still in the web. They're just in a different part of it. Okay, so that witness observer, you're there when you have no stories about what you see.
Yeah,
That's
and I think
that's your indicator.
Powerful. Yeah, that's such a powerful piece of that, because if we believe that we are that ego identity, then we think that we're an observer perspective when we're in that perspective initially, and we say, yeah, I'm doing it wrong.
Yeah.
I'm noticing I'm doing it wrong.
That tells you you're not in the observer perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you have no commentary, there's no narrative, there's just like, maybe at the most, oh, this is interesting. You're just watching something like curiosity, like, oh, what's happening here? This is interesting. Curiosity. That's a good point to stabilize yourself.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a few seconds of time in the beginning.
Yeah. And that does take practice and time. And so I think when even you notice, oh, I'm trying to go into observer perspective, but I'm just judging myself. Excellent. That's a good starting point. Is it the end point for observer perspective? No. But it's a good first attempt.
Because your intellect is reaching over there, you're judging yourself, but your intellect is reaching over there to awareness to go, I am judging myself. You're not in the observer of the part judging yourself, but like part of your intellect is over there going, that's what's going on over here. So you're drawing from it. You haven't stepped into it, but it might be 10 or 25 or 30% observation while it's 70% judgment. It's not like it's a switch. Oh, you can be, oh, I'm watching myself judge myself, or I'm watching my mind judge me. It's like, it's an incremental thing to move out there. It's not oh, I made it or I failed. It's like, give yourself time to get it 20% right and 40% right, and feel like you're 60% there. Like, I'm half in awareness and half in judgment. It's like progress.
Yes. Yes. Awesome.
Mind is a funny thing. That we can have all these points of view at the same time.
Yes. Yes. The other lesson, and this is something that comes up, I think, through your practices a lot, is thinking about abdication of power. And again, we talked about paradoxes earlier, and I think there's a paradox in here where we initially step out of victim perspective of things are just happening to me to I can have some autonomy here, I can have some personal responsibility, I can have some agency and choice. But then we also learn that the universe is incredibly powerful, and what we have control over is minimal. And I think that abdication of power,
paradox.
Yeah, it's a paradox, and it's complex. And yes, initially we do want to step out of that victim perspective of I have no agency or control here.
Yeah,
I'm like a
life
feather in the
life is
breeze.
doing this to me, for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're making me angry. They're making me sad. Life is scary. Never get ahead. It's like, yeah, we talk ourselves into powerlessness and not doing anything. So you want to, so yeah, there's this hump to get over to like recognize, oh, that's now you're stuck in the web. But people then want to go to, like, take responsibility for your situation. But then there's the mind that wants to jump in. There's always kind of like a counter move of the web that tries to put you back in the center, right? So you go like, oh, and I think I tell in the story, it's like, I got myself here in this relationship, in this job, and I'm burned out, and I did this to me. Yeah, I was very lucky. Somewhere I hit the took responsibility without applying fault and blame.
Yeah.
Because this is what the path you have to walk. You're like, I'm responsible for getting myself, I'm in this relationship, I'm in this financial situation, I'm in this emotional state because of my belief systems are running amok. Without jumping into the narrative, I'm so screwed up, things are terribly wrong with me, I'm such an idiot for getting myself here, I'm so stupid. Like this kind of blame, condemning, judgmental voice. Yeah, it's all my fault. It's like the subtle difference between I'm 100% responsible for where I am and I'm not at fault.
Yes.
Okay. Those are two completely different stories. I'm 100%
Yeah.
responsible for my situation in my life, and I'm not at fault.
Yes. And
So
what
this is that thread. This is, yeah, this is critical.
yes. And again, who's making that assessment? Is it that, like you say, the spider in the middle of the web, from that perspective, looking at, well, if I'm responsible, then I'm to blame?
Now the web is doing one of those stories that it does to put us back into. And that blame could feel like, oh, that is a horrific guilt, shame. I'm such an idiot, stupid state to be in. I want to avoid that emotion, so I won't take responsibility. I'll blame other people. And we can kind of feel righteous and empowered and say, oh, yeah, it's all their fault. And they did all this to me. So we can kind of feel morally superior in our victimhood, and that feels better. But so it doesn't feel good. Feels better than being at fault, but it doesn't feel as good as being responsible.
Yes.
Being responsible without being at fault feels really good.
Yes. And, I noticed the difference there is, I often say to myself, why does this make sense? Why does it make sense that I did that? It might, from a judgment perspective, I can look back and say, well, that was a bad decision. But from that more open and curious and empathic perspective, I can look back and say, why does it make sense that I made that decision at that time? And then that helps me get into responsibility. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm responsible for that,
But
but I'm not going into judgment and self-blame.
exactly. You need a path to a narrative that bypasses this self-judgment, self-blame. Because you have to step away from that story and go, okay, well, it did make sense. It wasn't a bad move, but why was it a good move? And you find it and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm responsible for the choice I made, even though it turned into X, Y, and Z, which didn't turn out, and I don't like where it ended up. It was the best choice I could come at the time, and it made sense this way. It's like, so anyway you can avoid that self-judgment. The two big monsters of the mind that keep us trapped are the self-judgment and fear.
Yeah. And it's just coming to mind for me, I think other people try to help us not go into self-judgment by saying to us, oh, no, you're not to blame. The other person's to blame.
So then
And
there would be the third one of like blame someone else, judge someone else.
blame
Like
someone
that
else.
keeps you stuck too.
Yes, it still keeps you stuck because you're still a victim there. You're still powerless. You're still abdicating your power, but they're helping you out a little bit by saying it wasn't you, it was the other person,
Yeah.
which doesn't feel great.
You get to avoid, fault and blame, which you can avoid another way just by being responsible, not believing the judgment story. But yeah, it keeps you into a powerless quality, but it's this covered up with this coating of moral superiority.
Yeah.
So when you mix it up,
Yeah.
that's
And so it would be easy also to go into that next phase of, well, if I'm 100% responsible, then I can control everything and get exactly the outcome that I'm after.
yeah. Try parents. I say that like you have an amazing, this is amazing paradox with your children. You have 100% responsibility for your children, taking care of them. You have zero control. Okay. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, responsibility does not mean control. I'm
Mm.
responsible for my car. Okay. But yeah, another driver might hit it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. It might just break down and get it all by itself for something. Okay. I have to take care of
Mm.
it. Like, okay, then I need to go do this to get it back together. Does not mean that I can make it do what I want it to do at will. I'm responsible for this body, but it does most everything by itself in the way that it does it.
Mm. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I really think that can tie into the story that if I do good, I'm 100% responsible, and I do good, my outcome should be good. And like you say, I could be driving along, doing a great job. I'm aware, I'm focused, and someone still bangs into me. From that earlier perspective of someone is to blame here, then my mind may still want to go to, well, did I do something wrong? Am I going to blame myself, or am I going to blame them because I got a negative outcome?
Yeah, this is a tendency of the very reactionary kind of judge victim pattern of being trapped in fear-based belief. There's a strong judgmental thing. It's like anytime something goes wrong, goes bad, the narrative goes to who's responsible, because we want to blame and find fault with that person. Like that, that's a really painful disease that we live in society when we're doing that. Uh, who's responsible, because it's become intertwined with who's at fault.
Yeah.
And you have to separate those out. Okay. And it's say, I'm I'm responsible. I'm not at fault for whatever happens.
Mm.
Okay. And it doesn't mean I control it, the outcomes.
Yeah.
I make the best choices that I can for what I know.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're taking personal responsibility and having sovereignty over ourselves, exercising choice and agency, and knowing there's only so much we can do.
And then
I
and
can't
then we
control
like
the weather.
and then we live our life and we see what happens.
Yeah.
We're like, okay, now what's going to happen?
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
When
So,
I
I'm noticing that change in perspective with, I almost think of it as that lens that we're looking through life with. Are we looking through life from that set framework that we've constructed and the identity that we've constructed, and that right or wrong way? There's a right way,
with
a
that
wrong way,
narrative ready, yeah.
or
Oh, am
through
I
the
making
lens
the
of,
right choice? I'm making the wrong choice, and that pressure because that leverage and emotional. Oh, I'm going to be judged, and if judge myself if I get it wrong, get it right. Yeah. When you're like, yeah, I might be forced to try to find an answer
yeah,
to avoid feeling like I screwed up. When I don't know what the outcome's going to be. I had when I was in college and I was in the ROTC, we had a captain on a ship come, and he talked about the decision-making process. And I'll leave the scenario out, but he gave us the briefing on his situation, where he was in the Persian Gulf. He had this threat. And he's like, okay. And he gave the briefing, same briefing he like gave to Congress or something like that. And it took about an hour, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, okay, here's all the situation. Here's the background. Here's the intel. Here's the threat. This looks like a missile coming at us. We can't tell if it's a missile or, a plane, but it's coming at us, and it's got this profile. And this is what we know about the threat. And this is the intelligence we have. It takes an hour to set up the whole picture. And he says, now, everything that I've given you from the time that this threat, that the tracker on the radar took off, actually is happening in about 6 minutes. He says, so we've got 6 minutes to process all this information where we might be hit with a missile. And you've got another 2 minutes to act, or else the missile's going to hit you. What do you do? And he said that's where he made his choice. But it's fun. One of my fundamental takeaways, one of his fundamental things, he says, we had 60% of the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We knew 60% of what was happening. We could look at our radar screen and see so much. But we didn't know everything. We didn't know why. But we decided to act. Okay. And that's kind of how life is. It's like you've got a certain probability, and you're going to have to make some decisions with about 50 to 60% of the information that you'd really like to have.
Yes.
About what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah.
If I go take a plane flight, I'm 99.999% confident that plane's going to land fine where it's intended destination, because they're really reliable. Okay. But when I started this business, left my corporate job to start teaching. I didn't know what was going to happen. Didn't know. I made an assumption. I said, I'm gonna go for it. And I was panicky about it. I had an afternoon. Well, for an afternoon, I decided I was going to do it, and then I was panicky for an afternoon. I'm like, what the heck's going on? Well, it might not work out. I sat with that panic. I'm like, it might not work out. I'm like, okay, well, and then what I'll do? I'll go get a job. Okay. I'll be back where I am right now. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't work out. Fine. I'll do this. I'll go get a job and then figure out how to maybe build a business more over time. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Decisions without knowing the outcome.
Yeah.
Decisions based on an assumption of the outcome.
And what I'm hearing there, underlying that, is flexibility. Yes, if this doesn't work out, I can go back to a different job, or I can find a different job. There's flexibility in that. And the underlying story that you have about yourself, do you tell yourself, I can cope if it doesn't work out the way I wanted it to? Or do you have the story, I can't cope if it doesn't work out exactly the way I want it to?
Yeah. Can I live with that? Yeah. So
I think,
yeah, because it's like, if this doesn't work out, where will I be? What's the narrative of that position? Will this be catastrophic? Will it be catastrophic because what would people think of me? Will it be catastrophic because the stories I tell myself or what I think people think? Will it be catastrophic because now I won't have a penny and I'll have nowhere to live because it was too much of a financial risk. So it's like, is it terrible? And because of the story, is it terrible because of a real situation? So yeah, what are you going to do? So this was, this is, I mean, I think back to the Navy, and I was in school to be in the nuclear power program. And I was struggling. School was kicking my butt, right? And but there was another guy in the class near me, and Paul, and we were like get our test back, and we were afraid to flip it over. Like, okay, I mean, like, it's like you pass. You pass. He's like that close. He's like, yeah, I'm okay. He looks at me, and I look and go, hey, you passed. I'm like, I just made it that close. He's like, okay. He's like, hey, but if it doesn't work out, we'll go to the beach and sell banana bobs on the beach and go sell some ice cream. So we joked about it.
Mm,
But in the joking, there was this other narrative. It's like, I can go have a whole another life.
absolutely. Yeah.
So it's like, I will do something else. So I go do something else.
Yeah. And so there's less fear around there, around uncertainty.
I think, just having that joking around about other options, and it's like, there will be some, okay, I fail out of the school. And then the story didn't stop there, because if we stopped there, now we're stuck in this very terrible
Yeah.
scenario of failed. But then if we build a story like, well, and then what will I go do?
Yeah.
Where will I go? How will I adapt? What's my next move? Like, oh, okay, I'll go do that. I'll go do this. Like, okay, well, I'll go figure out the next thing. Like, it's being stuck in the narrative story that usually what our mind does puts us in the worst case scenario at the worst time, and then the story stops and holds us there at that time frame in this
Mm-hmm.
imagined future, and we have to then go get ourselves out. We're like, okay, move time forward in your imagination. What will you then go do? And you're telling your brain, we're not stuck there. We will go do this. We will sell ice cream on the beach. We will,
Yes.
you know,
Yes. Which
it's
is a
like,
big perspective shift
yeah, we will go
because
do something.
that, yeah, that rational mind part narrows its focus and says, the issue here is pass or fail. That's the issue. That's what
Yeah.
I'm going to focus on. Whereas the other perspective is much bigger picture. Yeah, this is part of it, but there's more to the story.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a stepping stone on whatever is going to happen in my life, versus
Yeah.
this is my life. This is who I am. This is where everything stops and stays there forever. So you have to, and this is the difference between I'm stuck in a story and
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to move myself along different paths of the story. And this is tying it back to the conscious observer perspective. The conscious observer perspective can see, well, that's a story stopped in a frame of time with emotion. It's like, but let's move time forward. What will I go do? And now you start moving the narrative and your imaginary future self through different paths. And now you're no longer stuck and you can cope. But you can do that only from this observer perspective, who can manipulate these elements of the story, the narrative, that you can't do from within the story. Oh, I'll be stuck. It'll be devastating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I
so
think
it's
that's
like,
so,
that's the difference in that, why that observer perspective point of view is so critical.
yeah. Yeah. And I know when I'm working with people who've experienced trauma, a lot of the work is about getting back to a position where there is agency and choice, and learning that there's always agency and choice. Um, unless we're in some really threatening situation. Um, but if you pass or fail, you get to have choice about that. What am I going to do if I fail? I'm going to go and sell ice pops on the beach.
Yeah.
You're exercising agency and choice there. Or if someone runs into me in my car, what am I going to do next? What's the next part of the story? And
What's
I
the
get
next
to have
milestone?
agency and choice around that. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Fabulous. I could talk about that for ages.